Well, they said 2021 was going to be different, and they were right, but probably not for the reasons that we were all expecting. So there we go. Welcome, everyone. It is 2021, and we're back. So we've got another hour of editing, live editing in Capture One. That's with me. You're stuck with me. If you don't like that, then I'd click the little X button. If you do, then you're welcome to stay. Remember, you can put in all of your comments into the live chat. We'll try and cover anything that comes up as it comes along. I may not get to everything. Sometimes we miss a couple of things, but we'll try and do it as interactively as we can. So first things first, before we get started, the version of Capture One that we're using today is version 21. The issue that you'll have if you're using version 20 is that you won't have a couple of tools, dehaze and some of the speed edit stuff, but in general, you'll be able to follow along just fine, as long as you're on a version that's current, as in 20 or 21 and supported. So with that in mind, if you do want to switch across to version 21 and you haven't upgraded yet, to those people that didn't know, there's going to be a bit of a price change later on. I think it's the 11th or something like that. So if people are thinking about upgrading, have a look at what's in 21. You can go onto our pro tips thing and have a look in there. But after the 11th, you might find that price changes a little bit. So it's worth having a look at if you were thinking of doing it anyway. Okay, Claudius just said, figure something out. The 1440 quality can only be selected if you're watching in a browser. Yeah, actually, we found this out about 9 months ago. Safari, so Facebook actually compresses this video quite a lot. So you're better off watching it on YouTube, and YouTube in general is better in Chrome rather than watching it necessarily on a mobile screen as well. So you'll get the full quality if you watch it in the browser. Watch it in the app, I think it is limited to 1080. So there we go. Right. So Jim's just said, since I got version 21, I haven't had a shot that needed dehaze. I'm sure that's coming. Certainly in the northern hemisphere, winter's now bringing a lot of fog in, so we can hopefully make use of that. So we're going to start off. So over the next couple of sessions, I'm going to cover some of the we talked about before and after stuff in general. The images that were sent in, I'm going to pick a couple of them for each section, and we'll go through it. So this was from, I'm not sure what your full name is. I know the email address is richardslj. I'm not sure who that is, but there we go. So this is our December version of the same shot that was taken in March last year. So one of the questions that came in with this was about color management and white balance, and actually you've kind of nailed it on the newer version. So I would agree the white balance was a little bit off. It had a little bit of a blue tint to it, a bluey green tint to the overall image. Fast forward a few months, we're in a much better place. We've got nice sharp details in here. I can't see too much with it because we're on a JPEG version, but this is really nice. And Alf sent in this one, which was a pretty heavily rescued picture. So we've gone from silhouette to a load of detail down here in the ground as well. So it's great. It's great stuff. I mean, this one, I think Alf, you said this was from 2010 or something like that. And a re-edit with a lot more information in there. So there we go. Let's have a little look at a couple. So one question that's come in: what's my opinion on the new price hike? Is it justified considering the new features in 21? So to be honest, Prasad, I don't. Well, I was about to say I don't have an opinion. Of course, I have an opinion. My view is that it's been done to effectively realign the software. So what you get, and the price hike mostly affects, price hike as you put it, mostly affects the upgrades when it comes to the branded versions of Capture One. So that's the Sony only, the Nikon only, the Fuji only, and so on. As part of it, they've put the number of seats back to 2. That had been reduced down to 1 for new purchases. If you already had it, you were stuck with the 2 already. So that's come back up to 2 seats. And the challenge that you have is, even if you buy a branded version, you're getting a much, much lower price for effectively the fully featured software. So what this does is it brings Pro and the branded versions more into line, and it's just that Pro allows you to use it across multiple different platforms of manufacturer of camera, whereas the branded version will only allow you to do it on the one. If anything, you could argue it makes Pro look slightly more attractive because you're not limited to one camera, and the price difference is now smaller. But there we go. The decisions on pricing, unfortunately, are not down to me. They're the Capture One guys that do that. So let's get started with this shot. This is from Steve. Now, Steve, you talked about the RF. I want to get it right. It's the 24-240, I think we were talking about in this shot, and the fact that it's not profiled. So, yep, you're absolutely right. It is not profiled in Capture One. At the moment, you won't find that. Where are we? That lens in the listing that we have from our Canon glass. My gut feel is it will be. So I know it's a bit of a sad thing. You sort of say, well, hold on a second. You know, my lens will never be supported. I think these ones, the new batch of RFs from Canon, because they're becoming more and more mainstream, it's highly likely that they're going to be supported. So I don't know a timeline on it, but it's probable that you're going to get a profile loaded in there. That said, even without the profile, we can still do most of the distortion correction and everything within Capture One. The generic profile is actually pretty good. So let's have a look at this one that we've got up here. Now, one thing, and it's a bit of a question, so I'm not sure if you're on at the moment, but if you are, just let me know, because this vignetting around here, I don't quite understand how that's coming from the lens, because it's an RF lens which is matched to that RF or the EOS R series of cameras. So it doesn't really make sense that we've got this vignette here, other than if it's a filter holder, and you're at the ultra wide angle, obviously at 24, or it's some sort of thing that you were shooting through, maybe through a little window hole or something like that. But this vignetting here wouldn't be normal. And even with a lens profile correction, you shouldn't see this within the field of view. So if we remove that element from it, because the chances are it is something like a filter holder or whatever in there, let's look at the actual distortion that we're talking about in the lens. And there's a few things. So number one, we've got this curved horizon, obviously. The world isn't flat, obviously, but it's not quite that round, even at 24mm. We've also got a bit of a challenge up here. We've got some purple fringing up here, and we've got a bit of diffraction out here, a bit of aberration, all the normal sort of classic stuff. The stuff that would be fixed effectively with a profile. So let's have a look at our generic profile in here, and we're just going to leave it there. There's no reason to go to the pincushion one, because the pincushion distortion goes the other way. It's going to make it more rounded than it will out here. So we're going to go to the normal generic profile, and this distortion goes the other way. So it's going to stretch rather than punch the middle. But before we do that, it's probably going to be a bit easier if we start with a straight image. So let's just draw a line across our horizon here. I have to guess roughly where it is over there. That's going to make life a bit easier now when we do our distortion correction, because we can now follow those green lines and get ourselves completely flat. So probably about there. That'll do. Okay. Let's have a little play then with this edge out here. And one question that we can ask ourselves is, what crop do we want? I know this was talked about on Facebook the other day about the standard crop sizes and whatever. You can have whatever crop you like. And in fact, let's go all renegade for the day. Let's just have a completely unconstrained crop just for fun. There we go. Of course, if you're printing and framing your own images, you can do whatever you like. That's the advantage of it. Let's have a look out here. So out here we do have some, well, issues with our lens. So first off, let's tick on chromatic aberration. Because it's a generic camera profile, it has to do an analysis of this image, because it doesn't have a profile to rely on for CA. So it's automatically going to do that analyze, and it's going to create a lovely profile, and that's cleaned up quite a bit. If we turn it off, we can see these edges down here. And let's turn it back on again, nicely cleaned up. Still a bit of purple fringing on there, so we're also going to dial that in a little bit. And I'm being very unfair at that zoom level. I'm going to turn on some diffraction correction, which might help sharpen us up a little bit, even at 7.1. So from there, let's just go out to our pardon me, out to our wider image. Now we've done that distortion correction, I'm just going to double check on that horizon just to make sure we are completely straight. It wasn't quite, now that we've made that change. We can, of course, crop to our maximum so that we get the most of the image in. And I'm sort of there in a place where that's a clean, non-distorted, corrected, not profiled, but correct image for this lens. So I think we're in a place where over time you will end up, I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure the RF series will likely end up in there. But for now, generally, the generic profile, you know, even on higher end lenses and stuff like that, if it's not in there yet, the generic profile does a good job. You've just got to make sure that you're using the correct tools as well as just that profile. That profile is not a one click and it's done. You've also got to use some of this stuff. If you've got any sharpness issues at the edges, so some of this is diffraction maybe, but some of it is probably a bit of a sharpness fall off. Don't overdo this. You end up with a really, really sharp and tight set of pixels over at the edge. So, you know, keep it ideally below 100, but just to give it a bit of a boost. And remember, the sharpness fall off is like a vignette for sharpening. So it won't have any effect in the middle. It has its most or extreme effect out of the edges and in the corners. There isn't much vignetting in this lens, so, you know, light fall off is just going to look artificial because it's going to brighten the edges more than it needs to. Okay, so from there, you know, we could load into here. Let's just have a little look at what we can do to brighten up this corner. So I'm just going to put in a very quick, so a gradient layer. Remember in Capture One, if you don't have a layer already with a gradient on it, it's going to create a new adjustment layer as I do that. This is my mask here. Press M to see the mask, M to turn it off again. And with that gradient layer, we are just going to pull up the shadows. So not the whole exposure. If I pull up the whole exposure, we brighten everything, including the bits that are already bright, and then we can see that there's a gradient on there. So instead of that, we're just going to put up the shadows and a little bit of black. And then on the top part, now remember, I now have a gradient layer. If I want to create a new gradient, if I do this now on this layer, it replaces the gradient I had before. So we don't do that, we create a new layer, and we call this one Sky. And with this layer, we're going to just pull down our sky exposure, not too much. Just down to there, and yeah, we're in pretty good shape. So if I create a new variant to the original image and compare it to there, I would say that's pretty much corrected. Now whether artistically we want to do anything else with it, that's pretty much your choice, but I don't think the lack of a profile necessarily is going to stop us using brand new lenses for the time being. But keep an eye out on the profiles. I know there's a couple of, so David's just saying, are there any schedule for additional camera profiles? And Patrick's asking about the Nikon Z6 II. So what I do know is that new profiles are being added all the time, and I know that the Nikon setup is being worked on. I don't have a date, and I don't know the date that it'll actually be released out there, but I know it's on the workbench, so to speak. Okay, let's have a look then at what we're going to go for. Ah, yes, very cool. So this is a shot from Apurva. This is Zion, so Zion National Park in the US. And the issue with this is we've got a very, very, very bright sky. And we can see that in this histogram here on the left-hand side, this peak here. And all of this stuff down here is pretty well exposed, but we're overdone up here. I would argue, given, so this was taken on a relatively decent camera in terms of dynamic range. The D800 was the first sort of D8X series that came out. I would argue you could underexpose this a little bit. It might have helped. So actually what you could have done is gone from ISO 1000 maybe down to 640 or 500, something like that. You've got room in the shadows here to be able to pull a lot up. What you haven't got is much room in the highlights. However, this is actually a very, very good lesson in not doing standard things. And I'll show you why. In a lot of these sessions, we talk about quite often using linear response curves. So if you've got a shot which is particularly high contrast, so what we mean by that is it's got extreme highlights and extreme shadows, or you're going to have to do a lot of recovery in that shot, because when we look at the highlights, there's not really that much data in there. So as I move my mouse over here, look at those numbers at the top. So these numbers at the top tell us the values of every pixel I'm moving over. These are 255, 255, 255. They're overexposed. If I turn on my exposure warning, which is up here, yep, the whole thing is overexposed. We could have told that. Remember that the exposure warning is not telling you that every channel is overexposed. Here's an example where my mouse is right now. That's saying that the red is 229, green is 248, and the blue is 255. That means overall luminosity is 243, which is the grey one in that set of 4 numbers. So the exposure warning isn't going to tell you that all of the channels are overexposed. It's telling you that one or more of the channels is overexposed, and in this case, the blue. So there is data there in the reds and the greens, and probably in the blue, knowing this camera, but we just can't see it. So the standard response that we'd always refer to in this is let's use linear response, because linear response flattens out that curve, reduces some contrast, pulls in highlights, pulls up shadows, and we get a better place to start as a baseline. So let's try that. Ooh. So this is the challenge of having, and this is one of the reasons why, and you'll see in some of the comments that I respond to and some of the things that we talk about in the Facebook group, I will tend to veer away from, let's call it a standard recipe. So the second we start talking about this is the answer on how to do this, we've got a bit of a problem there because sometimes the situation changes. And this is a perfect example. So in theory, this shot would be great for a linear response curve. In practice, it didn't do much. So let's have a look at what we could do. So this is from linear response now, instead of the Nikon film style, so film standard. Let's see if we could pull back our highlights. Oh yeah, we can. And we can pull back our whites a bit more. Good. So that's looking pretty good, but I've still got to do some corrections. What would happen though if I switch to, I don't know, auto, and just pull down my exposure? I'm in the same place. So please, and the takeaway from this is, please don't expect that any one of the buttons in Capture One is a golden arrow or golden bullet or whatever you want to refer to it as. Often we've still got to do some tweaking. And the key thing for me is, in this case here, linear response, just as a one click, isn't going to help us. It's linear response plus some tweaking, or auto plus some tweaking. Either is fine, and in this case, I would actually be tempted to look at, so this is auto here. This is linear response. Again, auto, linear response. My gut feel, and it's going to sound counterintuitive, is to start with auto in this case, and pull back my highlights and my whites up in the sky. The reason being that auto curve gives me a bit more, just a touch more contrast, and it's going to give me a better base to start from down here. Of course, I can get back to this if I use linear response and I can do it through some work. But this is a good enough place to start with. I've got all that sky detail recovered. I've got the highlights. If I want to bring them back even further, I can. If I really wanted to, and this is what I was saying about potentially you could underexpose this a little bit. We could pull down the exposure by quite a bit too, maybe half a stop there. And then we can counter that in the foreground with a little bit of a soft gradient. And with that, we're just going to pull up our exposure down there a little bit. And we could, in fact, just pop in a touch of clarity. So we go from here to here with the auto curve, which, if we take it as gospel that, every single time we see high contrast or whatever, you've got to use linear response, that's the problem, because it does depend on the situation as to what curve is the best. I'm not saying in this case auto is the best. What I'm saying is that linear response isn't necessarily going to get you much better an initial reaction out of that change to the curve compared to the other curves that you've got access to. But certainly by doing a lot of the HDR pullback and a lot of the exposure change, you get a much more detailed image out here. And we don't actually need to do any luma ranging or anything like that around these trees. There's enough detail in this shot around these trees. I don't need to really worry about pulling much of that back. At the end of the day, it is a cloud. So let's leave it as a cloud. Okay, now, generally speaking, what we should have done before any of that stuff is just fixed a couple of things. So what I am going to do is turn on a bit of diffraction correction. You see how this sharpens up a little bit? So that's without, that's with. The one thing, and I said it a lot last year, we're going to continue to say it a lot this year, only use a button or a dial or a slider if you need the effect that it's going to give you. If you don't need it, don't tick it. Everything that you touch in Capture One risks the quality of your image. So lowest possible number of buttons for the maximum possible result. And what I am going to do is just turn up some purple defringings. We've got quite a bit of purple around those high contrast points, which is where you need to look for them. All right. That's pretty much it. I mean, what we could do, if we wanted to, we could warm this up just a touch. That feels a bit nicer there, like a canyon. There is an argument to say we could just pull up a little bit of a gradient down here to keep it dark, so we keep our viewer looking towards the direction of the river. So let's just pull that second gradient in, and with that gradient we're going to pull down our exposure there, and I'm pretty happy with that. That sort of works. So we go from there to there. We've got all the texture back in the rock, all of that stuff. If I want to, I can put on a touch of structure, little bit of clarity, and that sort of does it for me. So a couple of questions. Prasad said, I've noticed that linear response along with HDR pulls details in the highlight region better than auto curve and exposure. It can do. But again, it purely comes down to what angle you want to come at your edit from. If you want to be spending time adding in contrast, because the problem with this image is we do want contrast. I need that contrast between the sky and the rocks to be able to see some of the features in the oops, let's not do that with a gradient. Let's do it with our zoom. I want this contrast up here, and linear response is going to flatten that. Now, I can then choose, so do I go from linear response and pull up a load of contrast, or do I go from auto and pull down some of those high contrast points to the point that I need them? And Earl's just said, one thing I've learned in these months is not to throw away a file before looking at different curves. Absolutely. And actually, even creatively, you know, even after we've made those changes, I can still go back with those changes. It doesn't make any difference. I can still go back to my base characteristics area, and I can change my curve at this point to whatever I want. So that was the original curve there, and actually it has recovered some of that stuff. That's linear response, and you'll see what I mean. It feels flatter as a result. We've got a portrait curve in there for portraits and humans and stuff. Humans rather than rocks. But we can start from any of these curves however you like. What I've also seen quite a few people do, funnily enough, is you can start, of course, from any other camera's profile. So you can start from another profile within your camera, but you could also, if I actually like the look of the 5D Mark III profile from Canon on my Nikon camera, I can use that as well. You're not stuck with the camera profile for your camera. That one's likely to be the most accurate for your particular set of lenses and cameras, but you're free to choose whatever you want in this base characteristics and have a play. Where are we? Claudia's just asked, I noticed that in layers the sharpening is set to 0. When you apply sharpening on a layer, does it add to the existing or default sharpening? From memory, Claudia, I think it adds, but let's just test that out. Can't remember that, I haven't done it for so long. So let's just have I'm going to clone this variant, and out here we will add a certain amount of sharpening on our background layer. So let's go to there. Okay. And I'm going to create another clone of that variant. And on this one, you rightly say, so whenever I create a layer, let's create a filled layer. The sharpening amount here is set to 0. And if I add any onto it, so in theory, if it weren't cumulative, then that amount here wouldn't be any more sharpened than this one here, but it is. So yeah, confirmation, because I actually had a bit of a brain fry there. It adds on. So every layer that you add on an extra element of sharpening, it's going to be cumulative on top of any background sharpening or any previous layers. So that's the reason why when you create a new layer, the sharpening is set to 0. Same, in fact, from memory, yes, with noise reduction. So both sharpening and noise reduction work in exactly the same way. The second you add a layer, those settings are set to 0 because they add on to any previous stuff that's there. Okay, so let's have a little look at one question that came up, and in fact I nearly forgot about that, and I promised that we would do it. So exporting for Instagram. Let's use this picture as an example because we've got it up on our screen. So let's have a little look at our process recipes. These are the, in general, generic process recipes that come through. I think from memory, this is either a standard one, the Instagram optimized, or the 20481 for web use. I think either David or one of the team at Capture One created these as a standard sort of usable web thing. The Instagram one obviously is set to 1080 pixels, but it's also set to 80 quality, and there's a couple of other things that I personally would change. So I would just leave it with me for a couple of minutes to explain, and then we'll come back to these the process recipe itself. So apart from Pablo's suggestion for Instagram, which is increase saturation, increase HDR, and make it fake. So I'm sort of on that page. That's the problem. So let's not do our standard Instagram of this setup, but let's imagine that we were. Not exactly like that, though. So here's our picture. Now, as we go into these settings, I'm just going to describe a couple of things that are different from my setup to what the standard one is for the Instagram optimized recipe. First things first, I always move output location up to the top, and then process recipe, and then output naming. The reason is that's the logical steps that Capture One actually does with it whenever it's doing its process recipes. What I mean by that is people get confused because in process recipe, we've also got a file option in here, and you can choose output location or image folder. But if I set an output location as, let's call it folder A, and I then put in a subfolder in here, folder B, the location is going to be at the root folder A, subfolder folder B, and then down here the image name. And of course you can add tokens on, and you can put in extra functions to put in extra subfolders and so on. But this is the hierarchy that your process recipes will work to. Output location is the root, then the one that's recipe specific. So this output location always stays the same. It doesn't matter which recipe I choose, it's always going to stay in that place there. This is a global setting that you set for your output. This one, process recipe, so let's call, let's say in our Instagram one, we put a subfolder called Insta. And in our TIFF for Adobe, we put in Adobe TIFF. And in our full-size JPEG, we'll call it FS JPEG. So now, if I go into my Instagram process, that's the subfolder. If I go into my TIFF process, that's the subfolder. If I go into my JPEG process, that's the subfolder. But they are all going to be subfolders of this root. If I change this destination, it will change that destination for every recipe. You can see this bit doesn't change. So the recipe specific bit to me comes under that global output location, and that's why I have it set up that way. So my global output location is, in this case, we'll call it Instagram demo because I've got a folder there set up. I'm not going to have a subfolder, but I could do, and that subfolder depends on your recipe. The output location does not. Output naming, that's up to you. Now, let's go into our Instagram optimized recipe. And in fact, rather than this, I'm going to create a new one. So we're going to leave it in Instagram demo, output location. If I wanted to, I could call it 1080 wide, and there's a reason why I'm not going to call it that, Instagram output whatever. So a few things. Instagram itself, there's a lot of rumors out there and a lot of theories out there that if you keep your image under 500K, or if you keep the compression under 60% or whatever, Instagram won't touch your picture. Completely false. So Instagram, the second you upload a picture into Instagram, it is processing what's called a source set of images, which are the things that mean that they work on retina screens, small screens, big screens, and so on. So you upload a 1080p picture, it will create all these different resolutions for exactly the purpose that it needs, which is one for a preview, one for a I don't know, one for a iPad version, I guess, but it's the same resolution. But anyway, all of those things are done in the background by Instagram. And as it does that sizing, it also does some compression. And you cannot control that. What you can control is the quality of the picture that you send in the first place. And as you all know, same thing with taking a picture. Better in, better out. So this quality factor here, there is no point, genuinely, in setting it at any less than 100. If you want the best possible quality to come out of Instagram's compressed version of your picture, leave it at 100. Anything less than that, it is compressing an already compressed image. Next thing, color space. I know there's a hot topic about P3 versus sRGB and so on. As it stands right now, sRGB is still considered the only globally generic profile. So leave it as sRGB if you want to be truly accurate, or as accurate as you can be across every device that exists. A lot more devices are now accepting P3, but as it stands at the moment, you're better off and you're safer using sRGB. Resolution for print is very important. For screen, it's really not. And in fact, 72 dpi hasn't really been in use for several years now on anything modern, because we have retina screens. We have 2 times, we have 3 times retina screens. A 2 times retina screen is 144, 3 times is what, 216 or something like that. All of those resolutions don't actually matter a jot when it comes to displaying something on a screen, because on a screen, we only refer to the pixel count. So this resolution thing can say whatever you like. We can leave it at 300, we can leave it at 72, you can leave it at 1 if you want. It doesn't make much of a difference. For safety, I personally have this at 144. The reason being, that is the resolution on average that a retina screen is going to produce an image at. And in fact, it's even low for that, because typically they're at 226 now. But 144 is a safe, in theory, mathematical setup for a 2 times screen. Then we come on to our scale and dimensions. So everything on Instagram is 1080 pixels wide. So all we need to do, but I'm going to come back to this, so just don't take this literally quite yet. All we need to do is have that set at 1080. Everything I do on Instagram is going to be limited to that width. So if I have a wide angle landscape, if I have a 3:1 crop, it doesn't make a difference the fact that I chose it to be 1080 high or 2000 high or 10 high or whatever. Instagram is going to push it to 1080 wide, full stop. And whatever the height is as a result. So the numbers that are important on Instagram are at 1080 wide, you can have an image which goes from 4:5 in portrait mode. So not quite 3:2. That's one thing to bear in mind. 4:5 all the way through to 1.91 to 1. So at 1.91 to 1, you get to something like 560, 566 pixels high, something like that. That's quite a small picture on an Instagram feed. And remember that on your profile, as you go through, of course, it's going to crop it to be square. So whatever your height is going to be the width of it on the square crop as well. So it's a 1:1 ratio for that. Now, going back to what we said about the fact that Instagram is going to scale and compress and sharpen maybe your image. This is all about getting in with the best to start with, and then you'll come out with something better, hopefully. And the issue that a lot of people have with Instagram images is that they don't look sharp, they don't look clean, they don't look vibrant on the screen. Vibrant comes from using the right ICC profile. If you set this to Adobe RGB, which is actually what we'd recommend for print or even ProPhoto, when it goes to Instagram, it's going to look dull. If you set this scale, this width to anything less than 1080, it's also going to look blurry because Instagram's going to try and scale it up. Personally, I set this to 2160. And there's a simple reason for that, because I'm paranoid. So 2160 for 2 reasons, actually. Number 1, remember that first thing that Instagram's going to do is take your image and it's going to create different sized versions of it. It's going to create one at 1080, it's going to create one at 640, create one at 512, create one at 480 or whatever else. That's its little set of images, and that's what it stores on its servers against your original source file. I would sharpen at 2160 and let it then deal with the compression, because as it compresses down an already sharp image, it will keep that sharpness. But also bear in mind what we said about retina screens. Instagram has been 1080 for as long as I can remember. 1080 wide on a screen, yeah, okay, it's pretty clear. But I'm of the conviction that at some point Instagram might eventually switch to using retina-ized images. And if you've already been uploading your images at 2160, it already has the source image at double the resolution. So if I do it at 2160 wide, I'm going to end up with an image, my pure source image, bigger. Instagram then compressing and shrinking and using the sharpening I've already done to create a crisp 1080. And then using all of that good stuff that's at 100% quality of JPEG in the right color space to create all the other little versions of it and thumbnails and so on. So that's the basic tab. There we go. That was easy. When it comes to things like adjustments, well, crop, we want to respect the crop. Remember to choose your crop wisely. So if I want to make sure that this is going to work portrait, then I use a 4x5 portrait shot. Oh, sorry, portrait crop. Like so. Oops, pulled it too far. That's our portrait version there. So the other thing as well, don't rely on Instagram cropping your stuff for you. Make sure you get your crop right. So there's my 4x5. If I wanted it in portrait mode, that's what's going to come out on Instagram. We want the output sharpening set for screen, and these defaults are actually pretty good. If you're producing it at 2160, I would leave these defaults in. If you're producing at 1080 wide, down here, this width, I would be tempted to increase this output sharpening up to about 120 instead of its default. So that's up to you, and it's also down to your eye and how you want that picture to appear. But for me, general settings. So number one, have a source folder and move that output location to the top. It makes more logical sense. Create yourself a process recipe, and we can call this, where are we? Instagram 2160 or something like that. In that process recipe, we want to make sure it is JPEG. It is 100 quality, so I don't want this compressed out of Capture One. Instagram's going to compress it anyway. So let's start with a good place to begin with. ICC profile must be sRGB color space. Personally, I set this to 144. You don't have to worry about it. It's not actually going to make any material difference to your pixel count. And I would set this to 2160. So with that in mind, you then click on your little process button. And up will pop. Let's have a little look at our downloads folder, Instagram demo. So here's my folder. And if you remember, because I put in our process recipe under file, this extra subfolder called Instagram output, then we'll find this subfolder in here created. And in there is our 1050 or 1080 wide, or it's actually 2160 wide version ready to be uploaded to Instagram. You're going to see that's a big JPEG. It's 7.7 meg. The reason for that is because we don't have any JPEG compression on there. It's set to this 100 in here. But I'm going to upload the best that I can and let Instagram worry about the rest of it later on. Where are we? Dix just said, are there any special considerations you'd use for Facebook? Facebook, from memory, maybe I'll, in our, funny enough, in the Facebook group later on, I'll put up the recommended settings so that I'll effectively print screen some of these. From memory, I think Facebook is, I've got it in my other profile on Capture One, but Facebook has something like, I think it's either a 1400 or a 1600 wide limit or something like that. But of course, as you go portrait orientation, then it can show you more. So just be aware of it. Generally speaking, for social media, you want this scale to be limited at width. What this does is it allows Capture One to do the calculation for you of whatever height it needs for that width. And remember, we're doubling the width here because in part I'm paranoid and looking at the future, but in part because in my experience, uploading a 2160 image at default sharpening, so back at your 80 level down here, will give you a better result than 1080 at a higher amount of sharpening when it comes to the image as it's produced on their platform. Where are we? So that's one question. Tim saying for Facebook. Okay, so because I haven't got my profile up here, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I promise later on today in the Facebook group, I will put the recommended settings for the recipes that you can use for Instagram, Facebook, and so on. Bill has just said for print to use ProPhoto RGB, or sorry, ProPhoto or Adobe RGB. Personally, I use Adobe RGB. Adobe RGB is, generally speaking, I've found personally, the most acceptable, generic, if you want to call it that, version of a print profile that any printer can take. I've seen variances with ProPhoto RGB for print that's not quite the same. They have a slightly different color gamut between each other, between ProPhoto and Adobe RGB. Adobe RGB, I would argue, is slightly less, especially when it comes to some of the richer or the more vibrant colors, but I get more reliable output if you use Adobe RGB. And then Apurva's asking, does Adobe RGB give you that much better color gamut? over sRGB, yes, it does. It's pretty huge. Forgetting sRGB, then Adobe RGB is one of the wider gamuts, but there are still wider ones out there. Right, let's have a little look at, oh, perfect, this was your image. Ha, there we go. I'm just going to undo some of these changes that I did so that we've got the original image back. And of course, I'm not going to labor the point, but Instagram, remember, the temptation that a lot of people have is to use this slider to the max. When you pull out an image into sRGB, what you'll find is when it's shown on Instagram, it's already a little bit richer than what you're seeing on the screen in Capture One. So give it a test first. Don't overdo it. Don't be whacking this thing up and then hoping that everyone loves the neon version of the scene. Generally speaking, people are calming down slightly, and we're coming back to a more natural view over the years. Okay, next image. This one's from Alf again. So this was one that I think Alf put in the Facebook group about how to get some of the detail up and the sharpening up on his mother, I think it is. I think it's your mother. So let's just start with where we can begin from. First thing is obviously there's a color cast on this shot. Some of that comes from the fact that it's vintage film. It's a scan of a negative, obviously. And you generally get cast when it comes to an older film being scanned in. In fact, the process of scanning can also bring in some cast as well. We could switch to linear response, which is going to calm down some of those highlights out there on the window. But actually, we need quite a bit of the contrast in here to be able to see some of the detail over her shoulder and so on. So I'm going to leave it as auto right now. Then I've got a bit of a problem, which is, because this is quite an old image, I don't know which bit should be neutral color. Certainly not that, because we've gone to green, and I'm just using the picker just to play around in the image and try and find somewhere that's, I guess, more neutral than others. We're not going to get it perfect, but I'm trying to get away from the greeny tint and the yellow tint, but also get away from that purple. So I'm going to start with there as a baseline. Now, what we can do, let's just forget all of the stuff around color for a start, and just sort out some of our details. So I'm going to pull up some clarity. I am going to pull up a tiny bit of structure, but don't do it too much on this stuff. Where we've got a lot of noise in this shot, pulling up too much structure, we're just going to pull up the noise. So be careful with that, not too much at all. We've got, Nigel says, can we get rid of this issue, please? I think you mean someone that's been spamming in the chat stuff. Once we, let's see if we can block that person there. There we go. Hopefully they're now blocked. So hopefully that makes it a bit better. Right. With this shot here, we've got obviously some of the artifacts in here that come from negative and dust and scans and so on. So we've got the healing brush, we've got the spot removal tool, so we can go into here and we can go onto there and stuff like that. So just be careful though. You'll see in here, look, with that spot removal thing, we've actually lost all the texture in the noise. So this is one of the reasons why more and more now people aren't using the spot removal tool. They're actually using the healing brush to get rid of these spots, because what the healing brush will do is it will blend in that noise and it looks a lot more natural than just smoothing out the image. So we're not going to do this en masse. There's quite a lot to do on there, unfortunately. But what we can do is make sure that it's picking up from the right areas. So like there and there. Yeah, okay. So in general, we'd use our healing brush to get rid of our spots rather than the actual dust spot tool or the spot finder in there. Clarity pulled up, structure pulled up a little bit. Let's just try something just out of interest. Let's create a new filled layer. And with our filled layer, I'm going to just try and use dehaze. Now, what this is doing effectively is adding in a bit of contrast, but doing it by removing that sort of general glow that's over the shot. We could do this a lot more, I would say, accurately using curves, but as it stands in here, it's done a pretty good job to start with. And if I were to choose a slightly different color for that dehaze, I wonder if we can get it a bit better. We've got a bit of a weird thing going on there when it does that from this haze color. But some of this is around choosing the right shadow tone to get the result that we want. And that's probably not too bad there. So if I were to undo our dehaze and redo it, it certainly cleaned it up a little bit. It's added in quite a little bit of detail in there. So let's have a little look then at what we can also do out here with all of this information. So out in the background, we've got our ability to pull down some highlights and our ability to pull down some whites. But in the foreground, we've also got the ability to pull up shadows and blacks. If I pull up my shadows, I'm pulling up a lot of that haze stuff too. And now with that shadows pulled up, we can see the difference that dehaze slider is actually having. That's without and that's with. So as we pull up shadows, we also pull up effectively the bit that the dehaze tool has got rid of. Let's have a little look at what happens when we pull up black. That's going to be a bit better there. So remember, shadows pulls up black and shadows. Black and shadows, yes. So the bottom, let's say 20% of the histogram, and that includes the bottom 5%, which is your blacks. Black alone only pulls up that bottom roughly 5%. It is not affecting anything above that. It's not affecting the rest of the shadows. So the stuff that's in the darkest parts of the image, if I really want to target that, I pull up the black slider. If I want to pull up everything that's in that bottom 20% or so, pull up shadows. But in this case, because the shadows is where a lot of that sort of haziness and blurriness and so on, we can do that independently of each other, and we can then use dehaze to pull in some of the detail again. We might want to just darken this area down a little bit, so I'm just going to create an area. We could call them dodge and burn, but let's just call them what they're doing. So darken and lighten for this case, and I'm just going to put in a really soft brush just around here, and with that I'm just going to pull down that exposure a little bit, and then I'm going to use my eraser again with a low opacity just to blend that in slightly so we don't see those issues quite so much. Now, there's one final thing in here, because we've done this with the white balance for sure, and the white balance is doing a reasonable job of trying to correct for it and getting it right. The white balance itself, though, is generally speaking quite a big tool, as in it changes everything in the image. So it's everything or nothing. It's moved everything to be more yellow or everything to be more green and pink. So instead of that, we've got our color balance tool. And what I'm seeing in here is we've got a slight difference between the shadows here, which are on the pinky blue side, and up here in the highlights, we're in this sort of yellowy green side. So if we wanted to try somehow and just pull those to be a bit more correct, well, we could pull our shadows up there. So you see on our color balance wheel, you've got this master wheel, fine. That's the master color balance for the whole image. So rather than this Kelvin from cool to warm and tint from green to magenta, we can change the entire balance of the image. But the powerful part in Capture One is the three-way sliders, because the three-way sliders give us the ability to independently tweak those shadows, left hand one, midtones, middle one, and the highlights, which is on the right. So in this case, I've pulled the shadows away from their bluey pink tint and moved them up into the yellows and greens. The yellows and greens of the highlights, I'm going to pull away from there, and we're going to probably go into there. So we're neutralizing. So if ever you see an image where you've got highlights that are in one particular cast and shadows which are in another particular cast, you can then use your color balance tool to counter that. Or you can use it to actually amplify it. You can use it to the extreme. Of course, we're going to crop this, but before we crop it, actually we're going to do a keystone. And that's a bit of a strange one to expect on here, but we've got a perfect square here that we can play with. So let's just use our keystone tool, four-way keystone, which is the scary one. And we're going to pull these things along here into the four corners and hit apply. That's going to straighten us right up. And I'm going to go into my crop. We're going to be outlandish and use our unconstrained crop for today, just because we're going to do it in a rebellious fashion. And there we go. So we've now got, in fact, there's a little bit left on the left-hand side of that frame, I think, of the cell. There we go. So they're actually quite small changes. If I create a new variant of this, there's the original. There's the final. Now, we would still, you can see, obviously, where we've pulled up all the detail in that shadow, we've also pulled up some of these extra dust and scratches and so on, or the noise. It's gonna take some time to get this photo looking correct. But in terms of color and in terms of detail, we've got a lot of it back. If we want to add even more in, there's nothing stopping me putting in a new layer. We'll call it the detail layer. And I'm going to create a brushed layer, quite big, because I don't want to pull up all of the detail everywhere in the image. It's just on our subject here. And with that one, I'm actually going to use the contrast tool for one of the rare times that I do, and a little bit of exposure. The reason I'm using the contrast tool in this case is because actually we've got a histogram here which is ideal for it. We've got a lot of information to the right of the center and to the left of center, and that contrast tool is going to stretch it even more. So we go from without and with. It's a small change again, but it's just going to give us that extra little pop on our subject. Where are we? So a couple of things on there. Where are we? Spot removal tool can adapt new healing brush algorithm. Yeah, so potentially where this tool, the remove spot tool, needs to go is using the same technology that's in the healing mask. The problem is that they do slightly different things. The spot tool is more of an average of the cell that it's selected, whereas the healing brush is taking another part of the image and merging that in. But the healing, certainly in this case on this image, I wouldn't be using the spot removal tool to get rid of these dust and scratches. I would be using the healing brush very quickly, and you can see actually how quickly it is just to get rid of some of these bits. Just do that. We can get rid of this scratch here and this scratch here. So it does a really, really good job very quickly of getting rid of this stuff. It's just going to take a little bit of time on a vintage photo because there's going to be quite a lot of things that need fixing. So combination in general is the answer, Alf, in this one. So in terms of using a bit of clarity, not too much, bit of contrast, getting the white balance corrected. If you can't get the white balance quite right because there's such a strong cast on the image, then remember that you can go into your color balance tool and use that, of course, to tweak the highlights, the shadows, the midtones independently of each other. Where are we? Andreas just said, is it possible to use the base characteristics modes from cultural heritage for color negative? I don't think so. I may be wrong on that one, but I'm pretty sure you can't. Well, if you have the cultural heritage set up, then yes, but if you don't, then you wouldn't be able to in the standard capture one. Do I use a tangent unit to control the ball and color grading? Nope. That's what my mouse is for, to be honest. So where are we? Would I try to darken the window any? Potentially, Tim, maybe, but the challenge is, of course, balancing this shot out. If we were going to do that, you're almost in a place of needing to pull up your overall exposure, but then you start to wash out the subject a little bit, and then create a new layer, which would be this one. So that's our soft sort of gradient here. I could select a luma range, but it's not going to work out too great because of the fall off I'm going to have to put in. But that would keep it away from some of the bits that I want to maintain. And with that luma range, then we could then pull down that exposure in the window. But what you're going to get is a disparity between the perceived contrast out here because you've pulled down those highlights. And the fact that we've had to pull up the foreground means that we're getting a little bit of washout, which wouldn't really help too much. Generally speaking, there's gonna always be a limit to what you can do with an old scan. That's going to be the challenge here. Right, let's just have one final look at one other image. So this is one from Pavel. To be honest, I went through the layers on here. It's good. My gut feel is it's a little bit over, and it's not too overdone. Don't worry. Yeah, oh, sorry, on the last one, yeah, JD's just said I like the nostalgic feel. I do. There is an element in these images of, you know, you see some of these things where they've been completely remastered and digitally remastered to be a modern photograph. There's a nice nostalgic feel to some of this stuff. So yes, we need to make it a bit better, a bit more visible, a bit more detailed than the original scan. But I would keep it feeling a little bit nostalgic, personally. Right, out here in Pavel's shot, the only thing is the sky a little bit overdone? I'm not sure. I don't think it is out of this world, as in actually it was a pretty epic sky from the look of it. All you've done on here is just pulled in some of those ultra bright areas. I'd be tempted just to, if we go on to here and show our mask, this has had a bit of coloration added to it, and the clouds have obviously been recovered as well. I would be tempted potentially just to back off this highlight recovery on the background layer a touch, just because it feels natural that there would be a hot spot in the middle of that screen there where the sky is. Of course, we can pull it all the way back and all the way back there, and you can get every bit of detail that your camera's dynamic range is able to record. But sometimes it's nice to have that little hint that this is where the sun was, because that's where the bright stuff is. What you can afford to do in this, for sure, at the moment you've already got the river brightening up here, but what I can suggest is adding in another foreground layer, because you've actually got a lot more room in the foreground to pull up some of these shadows. So again, we've got our mask here, and with that I'm just going to pull up shadow just a touch to there, and ultimately our blacks into there. So we go from there to there, but that would be the only tweak that I'd make on it. It's a nice edit, and it's a very dramatic sky. There's a lot of recovery in this shot for sure. You know, if I go back to that background layer, pulling up the shadow and the black in here, and that river has been recovered. But you have got room in here, and I looked in here in terms of noise. You've got room to pull up a lot more detail in here without making it too much of an issue. Oh, sorry, I've still got JD's comment on the screen. Sorry about that. So you've got a lot more latitude in this shot than you realise in terms of that foreground. And if I compare the original through to there, yeah, we're in a much better place in terms of all this detail. But just, you know, I agree in pulling back this, because this is overdone here, but I don't think you needed to pull it back to quite the same amount that you did originally. You can afford to have, let's call it, a little bit of a hot spot out in that sky. Do we have time for this one? Possibly not. So we will start next week with Slobodan's shot. There's a lot that we can do with this one, actually. I was having a look at this earlier, so there's a lot of range in here that we can play with. But for today's session, so good job on that one from before and after. This one, really good, Alf, from 10 years ago, in terms of what you can now recover from an image that was shot on a very old, now in real terms, camera. This shot here, the RF lens issue, generally make sure that you've put in, don't just put the request in to me saying, or to the group saying, I wish my lens was profiled. Do put that profile request into Capture One. So support.captureone.com, put the request in as a feature request to make sure that your voice is heard. The more people that ask for a lens to be profiled, the more likelihood it will be, and sooner. But my gut feel is that the RF line of lenses is likely to be profiled pretty well, because ultimately it is replacing the EF lineup that Canon previously had. That said, of course, as we've shown you in here, you can use the generic profile with all of the tools that are available and some of the straightening tools to fix this right up, and there's no issue. In fact, there's just one thing in here. I just want to pull back our whites just a little. Oops, not in the sky, sorry. Pull our whites back a little bit down here to get some more detail in those people down there. The shot from a pervert, remember, there's no necessarily one right curve to use for every picture. So linear response is sometimes better, auto is sometimes better, film standard is sometimes better. So play with those curves before you really get hacking away at a shot. And of course, I will put up later on the notes for what you need to look at for your process recipes for uploading to Instagram and Facebook to get the best out of the image that actually comes out of that platform after they've done all of their hacking and compressing and sharpening and all this other stuff. Right, so with that said, that's us for today. I don't think I've missed any other questions. Pablo's just said the Nikon film digitizer for digitizing film is amazing. Don't know if there's an equivalent for the Sony. I don't either, to be honest. But there we go. Brian's first live session. Welcome, Brian. Hello. So you get to see it live now. That's exciting. But more importantly, if you've got any questions from this session, of course, you can put them into the comments on YouTube. But also remember, you've got access into that group. So that Facebook group where we will continue this discussion if we need it. and that will continue for, I don't know, weeks, months, years, whatever it takes. And that's certainly where you're going to find the things like the process recipes put late in there later on. In the meantime, until next week, we've got all those pro tips things in there. So if you want to look at version 21, do it quickly before the price changes, I would suggest. And there's a pro tips for version 21 as a review in there that you can look at for free now. And in the remaining time between now and then, or next Thursday, remember to upload your files if you want them looked at and edited. So poreforlive.re or retransfer.com. Remember to include your name, and remember to include the raw file, not just the JPEG, so we can actually edit it. And after all that said, this is how to get in touch with us, and we will see you next week. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.